TikTok, censorship, iconoclasm, and where do we go from here? So today we're going to talk about the TikTok ban and what it means in the history of censorship and what happens next. So the word censorship comes from the Roman word censere, which was, and you might think, hey, what other word sounds like that? It is for census, right? We have a census taker, for example. So the role of censere was to count people, to ensure that they got the census, but they also were responsible for mediating and making sure everything was on the up and up. So anything that was seen as immoral or wrong, they had the authority to censor it. Now, in terms of censorship, and this is really important because TikTok's ban is censorship, or it could be classified as censorship because it's done by the government. Censorship, if a private company says that they will stop you allowing certain content, that is not censorship. That is the authority of the company. And I will tell you that as somebody who was a big creator on TikTok, or I guess a small bit creator maybe, one of the things that was very frustrating to me is that the algorithm really promoted a certain kind of content. And creators who produced any content that didn't fall in line with what their norms were often kicked out of the creator fund or completely deplatformed. And people could deplatform people if they got mad. And this was a very common practice on TikTok. That is not censorship. And this is an important thing as you think about what, as you think about Meta, for example, and the rules of Meta, that is not officially censorship. That is the right of that private company to decide what their norms are. If you're in a school-based situation and they don't allow you to use certain forms of communication, that is not censorship. That is the terms of service, and that is different. So today we're going to talk mostly about censorship, and then also another thing that's related to it, iconoclasm. Sometimes iconoclasm is also censorship, and sometimes it's not. So let's get into some examples of iconoclasm and censorship. So one that is very notable in the United States and has come up again quite often during the Trump campaign is the 1798 Act of Sedition. So what happens is this is when John Adams is president, the first John Adams, and he believes that if freedom of speech has boundaries, right? This is something actually in the United States we are consistently over the history of our country debating where the boundaries of free speech are. And so he does not like a Vermont elected official whose name is William Lyon, and he feels that William Lyon is speaking against him, and he feels like the office of president is something that you cannot speak against. And William Lyon is jailed. There's a whole thing. He has a fight on, like literally a fisticuffs fight in Congress. And it's not even fisticuffs. It's tobacco spitting and a cane hitting situation with another elected official named Griswold. It's a little bit of a mess. But the end of which is the Act of Sedition passes. And it's this idea that if you speak against the president, it is unlawful because free speech has that boundary. And in the Trump campaign, he has very often mentioned that he would like that to be enforced when he is president. Interestingly enough, he didn't feel that strongly when he himself was speaking out against Biden. So I don't know. I mean, maybe he feels like acts of sedition are only for some people. But that is one great example of censorship. And it was censorship used to push a certain political agenda because the Act of Sedition was passed against the people who were opposing John Adams. Interestingly enough, Thomas Jefferson and Madison both felt that this was wrong, the Act of Sedition, and they wrote against it, though anonymously, as state representatives. So in that instance, and the Act of Sedition, thankfully, has had many cases that have pushed against it. And so while it's still lawful, many, many Supreme Court cases have worked against that to allow us really the ability to speak freely without being jailed, right? That is sort of the key for free speech. It's about what happens when you talk, what happens to you, and can you speak without any repercussions? And basically using censorship to push a political agenda is a huge, huge part of our history. The Qing Shi Huangdi, who is the famous emperor of China, who really helped create the first unified China. He also has the famous tomb with the giant ceramic sculptures, burned numerous books because he's the first person who unified the many kings of the smaller kingdoms in China, and he didn't want anyone talking against him. And Confucian scholars were thinking their own things and writing about it. And so he burned numerous books, and then he burned numerous Confucian scholars. Potentially 460 scholars were burned under his rule because he did not want dissent. So it's not so different, actually, than John Adams' Act of Sedition. And this idea that thought is dangerous is something that really continues until today. There's been cases in China, thinking about the Chinese government and how they've suppressed any information in China about any dissent, including basically erasing everyone's memory in China of Tiananmen Square. You can have no mention of it. Many contemporary artists will use basically their art to share stories that the Chinese government do not want. Many artists over the years have left China as a result of all the censorship. And then, in the US, there is a lot of question about whether even today governments have pushed our social media platforms to push certain narratives about COVID, for example, or vaccination, for example. So censorship is something that is a constant in any kind of government, that it is something that citizens should always be concerned about. So we talked about political censorship, and I want to bring up, we're going to go back and talk about political censorship at the end of this, but I also want to bring up another part of censorship that is iconoclasm. So censorship is just the idea of holding back kinds of thought. And the thought can be visual text, it can be written text, it can sort of be anything. But another thing that's related to it, but isn't exactly censorship, is iconoclasm. And the word means like the breakdown of icons. And iconoclasm is most often religious items. So it's the breakdown, but you can also use it for probably the most famous kind of iconoclasm is in ancient Egypt, where one ruler comes in and they basically erase the face and the name of all the past rulers. That's iconoclasm too. So iconoclasm is specifically about visual imagery, so the removal of visual imagery. And there have been, different iconoclasms. For a lot of Americans, they probably might remember the iconoclasm that happened when in Afghanistan, they started destroying all of the Buddhist art that had been there from millennia before, from a millennia, 2 millennia before, like the Bamiyan Buddha. But for art historians, the most famous iconoclasms happened at the Protestant Reformation. Henry VIII approves the destruction of monasteries and any Catholic art that is in England. And then similarly in the Netherlands, communities, so cities, for example, agree to the destruction of items. Now, all of those examples I said for iconoclasm are also censorship. So not all iconoclasm is censorship. So if it's not done by a government or a political entity, it's probably not censorship. It's just really bad behavior. But those examples of iconoclasm are very much part of this. And I would say that TikTok, in a way, could be both censorship and iconoclasm, right? Because we are making visual images. And many people were using it to make their art. Stop motion animators, people who are filmmakers. So that's a kind of iconoclasm. And that goes in line with things like the Hays Code in the 1930s in the United States. The Hays Code was to make sure that cinema was appropriate for everyone. And this gets into the biggest issue about censorship and iconoclasm. Who gets to decide? And that's what's very hard about free speech. What we have found is without some sort of nuance, a lot of speech, particularly like on this platform, YouTube, there's a lot of misinformation about history. And the hardest thing about being an advocate for free speech is you have to allow free speech, even free speech that you don't believe. And that is why the biggest, most egregious thing about the TikTok ban is that it's banning all speech. The government is banning all speech. It doesn't matter if it's good. It doesn't matter if it's wrong. It doesn't matter. It is banning a form of speech. And so looking back on all of these examples, and you can also talk about the thousands of books that the Nazis burned, or the once 41 states that have book bans, now it's down to 29. All of these instances are restricting the access to knowledge. And even when the knowledge is something you don't believe in, the idea that a government can restrict knowledge means that your knowledge can also be restricted. And that's why the ban of TikTok is so incredibly egregious. I mean, there are plenty of people on TikTok who I don't agree with. There are plenty of people on TikTok who are making up history. They also have the right to speak. And that's the biggest summary of iconoclasm and censorship over history. Those ideas that, Qing Shi Huangdi's, the ideas of the mistakes he made still existed. We still know them, right? Like, a couple thousand years later, we can still look at history and see what he did, what his missteps are and what his successes are. The act of sedition doesn't keep us from seeing the flaws in John Adams, that he is seen as a flawed person. We still have that information. The Nazis burned those books. It does not mean that knowledge disappeared. And what you do when you cut the flow of information is two things. So the thing about free speech is it has to be thoroughly free. The government cannot decide what is appropriate, because then they are making value judgments, and they are not necessarily the person who gets to decide, right? Because they have a bias as well, which takes us back to TikTok. One of the biggest challenges with TikTok is that the government is generally older, quite a lot older than the people who use TikTok. The average user age for TikTok is 24. The average senator's age is 68. So the senators are legislating without really necessarily having a good knowledge base about this. Now, Trump created an executive order to ban TikTok because he wanted to basically ban it so that an American buyer could do this. This was in 2020, but then bipartisan support cropped up for it. And it's a lot of it for the same political reasons as the act of sedition, right? They worried that it's an unchecked way for political information to get out there. Of course, that means now that everyone's on Mastodon and Discord. I mean, you never stop speech, right? Humans want to express. So that is already, that sort of highlights how much the government probably doesn't understand. The other thing is that there's something like, billions, I think it was $12 billion worth of sales goes over TikTok in 2024, and that's ad sales alone. So you get a sense of the scale of the business that is actually coming out of TikTok. It's not just a teen dancing app, which is what I think originally a lot of people thought. But the other issue about this is we're seeing censorship, government censorship in relation to capitalism. Because while China has a minority share in ByteDance is largely capitalism. It's largely capitalists, very, very wealthy people. The CEO is worth $1.3 billion. And so what you actually have is a bigger problem that the US is not dealing with, which is that more than the fact that governments might have access to our data already for the last 10 years or so, big business has had access to our data, and our data is largely not secured. There are so many US companies that have had breaches of data, and we have no sense of what this data is being used for by these by these non-government entities, right? Corporations are definitely not trustworthy. They have not been elected. We don't usually know who's in power, and we don't usually know what's doing that. And so while they're acting to close down this because of the Chinese government, there is not the same urgency to close down big tech and how they're using our data. And I think that's particularly telling. And it's particularly close-minded. But to finish this episode off, I think the final thing to point out is that, you know, I'm filming this on January 19th, and I would almost put money on by the time this video posts and people start watching it, TikTok will be unbanned because in essence, I think what has happened is that Trump will make this his first win and that we will be back on TikTok and I will be able to make my green screen videos again. So this was a quick summary of free speech, iconoclasm, and TikTok and why it matters. Please like, follow, share, subscribe. I don't know, tell a friend, comment, tell me what you'd like to hear about next. Have a great day.